I know our time is limited, and I know many people have never heard of me. So I do want to spend just a few moments introducing myself, if I may. Um, Hopefully my slides will advance. They're advancing on my end, tech people. There we go. My contact information, very briefly, in case anybody wants to get in touch with me. I also consider myself to be a mentor in this space. So feel free to reach out to me on the social medias or plain old-fashioned email. I've been in the information security business for nearly 40 years. I was at the National Security Agency back when, as described in one of the lead up videos, the OG cybersecurity vendor Checkpoint actually came about, which was back in the early 90s. Of course, working for the government, we weren't really allowed to play much with foreign entities, even though, you know, Israel has always been an ally. We had all these weird import export rules and things like that. So I just kind of chuckled when I heard Checkpoint describing themselves as OG, because I've been doing it even longer than the company's been in existence. As mentioned, I was a cryptologist at NSA. If you want to hear any of my story and have ever heard of Darknet Diaries, you can go hear a little bit about me. I'm interviewed on episode 83. I actually was at NSA also at the beginning of this thing that we now call cybersecurity, but back then we called it internet security. And I was part of the first, what's now come to be known as Red Team, but cutting edge stuff back in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, doing ethical hacking and penetration testing and vulnerability assessment for the DoD. I'm in a series of books. If you want to read about some of my thoughts on a lot of different topics, there's a series called Tribe of Hackers, which is basically a series of interviews of a whole lot of industry professionals and influencers, and getting a lot of different opinions on the same set of questions, separated into 4 different books with different focuses on each one. As mentioned, I'm a host of a podcast called Security and Compliance Weekly. It's part of the Security Weekly network of shows. My day job, I have to give a nod to it. They let me come out and play like this. Online Business Systems. We're an IT company, but we have a security consulting practice. That's where I am, in fact, as advertised, qualified security assessor with PCI. And I hesitated when I was putting the slides together, putting this in here, because PCI oftentimes has a very bad reputation. But having heard in some of the lead up videos and even the discussion initially with Dorit, the cloud has a lot to do with PCI, and PCI has a lot to do with the cloud in terms of Checkpoints and other cloud providers, customer base. Not only the Fortune 100s and 500s, I've already heard mentioned lots of references to retailers and merchants and things like that. So I'm unabashedly a QSA. I've been doing PCI since before PCI was a thing, really going all the way back to 2004, when each of the card brands had their own information security, data security programs, and they wanted to have all of their merchant customers and all the third parties that they call service providers involved in doing some sort of basics of information security. Really brief history. I mean, we could spend hours and hours talking this type of stuff, but just as a broad sweep, the beginnings of internet security and network security really are based on, because it grew up out of the DoD, that's where the internet started primarily. It's based on very ancient principles of protection. You have something that's valuable, you keep it inside, and you put up walls of protection and layers of protection. Enter Checkpoint in the early 90s, and coming up with the what was revolutionary at the time, the first stateful inspection firewall. You'll notice that in the early days, it was all about keeping your corporate network, your internal network, protected from the dark, mysterious cloud of the internet. And that's, in fact, that's why we call the cloud, is because we always depicted the internet as the cloud. So it was easy back then. Just put up a firewall and protect who's getting in and out and monitor that access, and you're good. Of course, very quickly, it wasn't good, because all this amazing technology that's come about in the last 25, 30 years has created all sorts of layers of problems. As a practitioner, and I appreciate you mentioning that I've been a practitioner for many years, mostly as a consultant lately, but going and talking to dozens of companies that were setting up these very complex environments and trying to do the fundamentals of security involved me as a QSA talking to system administrators, services administrators, desktop administrators, IT administrators, network administrators, database administrators, business managers, legal, HR, and so on and so forth. And I was always very amazed that in so many companies, when I would talk to individuals, they would be expert on what they were doing. If I was talking to a DBA, they'd tell me about their database structure, and I asked them about what kind of data they're storing, and they'd say, I don't know. It's, I just set up the fields. They tell me the parameters. I don't really pay attention to what's in it. I'd talk to a server administrator, tell me all about the operating system. And then I'd ask questions like, what's the application running on it? I don't know. That's not my department. That's not my job. And this all led to, layers of the security being more complicated, and as well as what I'll get to in a moment, some of the problems that I think we face as security professionals that I think it certainly extends. My position is it certainly extends in today's cloud operations. The very common problems the companies have issues with. Checkpoint, of course, would be familiar with the idea of isolation or network segmentation, and of course, all the ways that people kind of good guys and bad guys find ways around the protections. It's already been mentioned numerous times, the whole idea of vulnerability management. Of course, this has to do with patching and keeping things secure. And then probably most importantly as a security function is that logging and monitoring and detection and response, which is, the ultimate goal is to find the attacks as they're happening, before they're happening, minimize the damages, and so on and so forth. But the problem, as I see it very often in companies, is a mindset amongst the employees of the companies, especially the people that I would interview, that from a security perspective, it's being taken care of already. It's somebody else's problem. What I do in my small minuscule task, whether it's DBA or server administrator or whatever, security is not really my problem. It's taken care of somewhere else. It's somebody else's problem. And so you get a lot of this going on. And part of that, again, is the idea that there's a lot of different peoples in very specialized roles, and these roles, whether they have understanding of what their responsibility for security is or not, part of the problem. But there's also the expectation that it doesn't really matter because somebody else has got my back because it's somebody else's problem. And then, of course, ultimately, many people hope for, and this is sort of the holy grail of our whole industry, is that automation, which is so necessary these days, is part of the equation, part of the solution. So, let's pull all that into the cloud, and in the context of we're outsourcing, we're moving things over to somebody else. Again, a lot of times from the perspective of, oh, if we outsource it, if we go to the cloud, it's not our problem. It's already been echoed, and I think hopefully well understood by everybody listening today, that it's not quite that simple. But with everything going to the cloud, if there's a message here today for the people that are working in the cloud, that are designing what you're doing in the cloud, whatever the plethora of operations are and functions are in the cloud, what used to be a lot of individuals doing a lot of different things, assuming it was somebody else's problem, very often now all those things are on your shoulders, and the fingers are now pointing directly at you in terms of needing to secure this. And I heard Dorit say, and I don't know if she intended it or not in her conversation, that going into the cloud, you have less inherent security, meaning it takes work, and it's very often your responsibility to do these things. So let me speak a little bit in the context of PCI, because PCI is the framework of security that many organizations have to follow, even though they've moved their operations to the cloud. And that's supported by what I've heard already, fortunately. Um, if you're at all familiar with the PCI data security standard, you know it's a collection of, depending on how you add it up, somewhere between 300, 400, 500 specific rules and security requirements, things you have to do. And it's a pass fail, all or nothing exercise to get compliance. These rules, in fact, bubble up into what 12 major requirements, and these 12 major requirements are further bubbled up at a high level, at a framework level, into 6 goals. And this is what I want to focus on a little bit. And my assertion to you is that even though you're moving operations to the cloud, all these things are still valid goals. Some people refer to PCI as a little bit archaic. I mean, the first standard was published in 2004. It was actually written sort of with e-commerce in mind, so it wasn't completely irrelevant today, but there was lots of references to paper backup tapes and floppy disks and um, modems for connecting to network systems and back office systems and so on and so forth. So certainly some of the specifics are dated, and the PCI Council has worked to update the language, but they've always been very committed to the principles, the frameworks, the ideals of these 6 goals of security. And again, I think these still apply in the cloud. You still have to create a secure environment, a secure network, even though it might be serverless, even though it might be all done in software now instead of a bunch of different physical devices. You still have data that needs protecting, and you need to understand the data flows. Where is it being transmitted, processed, stored? Is it stored on-premise, off-premise, in the cloud, hybrid, so on and so forth? In some ways, the cloud has just made things complicated. And for those companies that thought, oh, all my problems are over if I just flip to the cloud, most of them have figured out by now that, oh no, there's still work to be done. Protecting data, controlling access, doing all the security things like monitoring and detecting and things like that. And probably more importantly, as Dory again mentioned, responding, actually seeing the notices and responding and reacting to them. And the pesky part that everybody hates, again, Dory alluded to, I think we'd get along. I've never met her in person, but it's all ties back to process. Process is what drives this. 60% of the PCI data security standard is, do you have stuff written down either on a policy or a standard or a procedure? That doesn't go away. And how you do the things that you're saying you're going to do in policies and procedures actually has to be expressed in different ways using all the modern cloud technologies. And certainly, again, automation is a key to this, because there's just more than humanly possible to keep up with these days. Trying to advance. You may be familiar with something that's called the shared responsibility model. This actually, again, ties back, I think, to PCI. At least PCI formalized this concept a while back, but I've seen a lot of this in companies that I go to. There's a little bit of inflection in humor. But the idea that, this sort of underscores what I was saying earlier, that everybody thinks security is somebody else's problem, and the security people, they just throw up their hands at some point. I actually think this is problematic, because I think security people need to be integrated and be part and friends with and partners and work with all these others. But as I was saying, PCI, they put out this concept all the way back in 2013 with the release of version 3 of the data security standard, that says basically, and I'm paraphrasing, hey, if you, a merchant, are outsourcing to other third parties, if you have other third party service providers and various companies involved in your operations, make sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. Primarily and early on, a lot of merchants and retailers would flip over to the cloud for whatever. Initially, it was hosting their e-commerce operations. Then it became more and more infrastructure. But there was a belief that, okay, if it's in the cloud and I'm using, such and such a cloud provider, and they're already listed as a PCI service provider, we're good, we're done. Read the small print, and most people have read the small print at this point. What I see even to this day, though, with customers that I have is I have a merchant customer that has an e-commerce operation, and they've hired a third party to develop and maintain the application. And that company retains the services of what's called a payment processor, a payment site where everything is redirected either through network redirection, code redirection, more commonly iframes, maybe through an API, but basically it's a separate third party. And all of this is being hosted in one of the cloud providers. So you got 4, sometimes 5 different players involved. The merchant thinks, well, I'm good because I've outsourced to all these other people, and all these other people are PCI compliant. My concern is, and I've seen this far too often, disturbingly far too often, is that all the security goals that are in PCI still need to be met. Presumably they're being met by different members, different of the third parties for their little piece of the pie. But it's possible, and I've seen it happen, where from your perspective, you as any one of these entities, these third parties involved in this whole operation, can reasonably say, yeah, that's not my problem. That's really the problem of the merchant, our customer, or somebody else downstream that's also involved in this process that I do or don't have a contractual relationship with. So there's this, sometimes there's, again, back to this finger pointing somebody else's problem. Unfortunately, that means security things get missed. So my caution and word of advice is to pay very close attention to the idea of shared responsibilities. Somebody from AWS is speaking later today. Pay attention to them. AWS has done a great job putting together their version of a shared responsibilities matrix, which outlines what the merchant, their customer, should still be doing, specifically from a PCI context, what they're responsible for, what they're taking on responsibility for, and very often what responsibilities are shared. Or, the merchant, you still got to do something, we can do something for you. There's probably a 4th category in there, although not listed, but there's certainly services that AWS provides that can enable a merchant to meet a requirement, but it's a value added, it's an extra service. It doesn't come with the actual package. AWS has done a great job advancing that. The other providers too have something very similar. But again, my emphasis, because my customer is usually the merchant, is make sure things are all getting done. Ask the questions of all your third parties. Are you really doing this? Is there some sort of gap because you don't think you don't think you're responsible, but we don't think we're responsible, and we think somebody else is doing it? Are they really doing it? Those are the types of questions that you ask to my merchant customers. And if you're working for a customer that's moving to the cloud, keep in mind from a compliance perspective, which ultimately is a security perspective, you can't outsource the risk. It's still on you ultimately. And de-scoping is not security. It's related, but it's not. I like to focus on the security requirements. I like to make sure that they're still getting done. And again, to sort of recap, you as an architect, you as a DevOps person, it's often very gonna much fall on you now, all these things that used to be done by various different groups or silos within organizations. So walk into this well-informed. You're gonna hear a lot of recommendations and advice and guidance throughout the rest of the day here of how to do these things. Pay attention. And realize it may fall on you, but more importantly, or equally as important, make sure you're talking amongst yourselves, especially if there's different parties involved, and understand that it's not just easy enough to flip it over to the cloud and think you're done. I think that's been put to bed. That's about it. In the form of, I don't know if Peter, if you have any questions for me, or if anyone has questions, but just question things. Don't make assumptions about anything. Don't assume that the third party is doing it for you. Don't assume that the cloud provider is doing it for you. Make sure you ask. Thank you.